So Sil is our first moderator, or is the moderator for our first session. And today we have a challenge that Mark Dubina is the secretary, the director, is the director of security at Port Tampa Bay. And because Tampa Bay just won the Super Bowl and they've decided to have a major boat parade today in order to celebrate that. Sil, we're going to ask that after your introduction, we go ahead and have Mark speak first. So Sil is from the University of Alabama Transportation Institute and is somebody who is very steeped in resilience, having run it for the state of Delaware. So Sil, if you would please go ahead and introduce your panel today.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here with you. And this morning, Frank, I don't know if you had my slides. Okay. So this morning, we are going to be having a very interesting discussion with, as Frank already mentioned, Frank Dubina, that is the Deputy Director of Security for the Port of Tampa. We will also have Margaret Kurth, that is a researcher with the Corps of Engineers. She will be presenting to us a project that happened with the Department of Homeland Security for resilience of the marine infrastructure. And we will also have Casey, that is the Vice President of the Florida Port Council, and they will also be presenting a study showcasing resilience. But to get us started and getting us in the mood of thought, what I would like to explore with you just for a minute is this image here. So thinking about freight systems and about all the different concepts of resilience and security and sustainability, including diversity, it would be very interesting for us to have some food for thought. Every system has a life cycle, and in general, we have a certain expectation that everything is going to work well. When we face all different types of disasters, and here in the Southeast is very common, we have to deal with hurricanes, and we do have bad actors. And we also have insider threats, and we have common things like people that just want to have a space to be able to project themselves. So all of these different things that we can call human factors, they do provide challenges, and this impacts our freight systems as well. We have the security that in this graph I pushed as insecurity, because security in general we plan for, and this comes from the planning perspective. But we face insecurities, and that's why we are always trying to be in the front of all what can happen. And they can come from any point in time and any means really. So what is very important that we consider is exactly that we have adverse feedback that have consequences and can create alternative spin-offs for the life cycle. And we need to understand the trade between resilience and sustainability to provide continuity, looking at all the uncertainties and all the diversity of factors and spaces. So for this space of the Southeast, please welcome Mark Dubina.
As the introduction said, I'm Mark Dubina. I'm the head of security at the Tampa Port Authority, also known as Port Tampa Bay. And I'm very happy to be here today to speak to you on the subject of security and as it relates to resiliency and sustainability in the transportation system. So I thought it would be helpful to talk about first what we're actually protecting. So I'm going to use our port as an example. There's this saying in the port industry, if you've seen one port, you've seen one port. So everyone's a little different, but we do have some commonalities. In our particular case, we're the largest port in Florida by land mass, over 5,200 acres. And we're also the largest port by tonnage. That's the cargo that goes across our docks. We have a very diverse mix of products. As you can see on the screen, I'm not going to read them to you. But when it comes to resiliency and sustainability, there's a number of different areas that we touch on that are vital to our community. One in particular is the fact that over 45% of the motor fuels used in Florida come through the Port of Tampa channels. In addition, we do major exports of fertilizer from Central Florida, which is a large economic driver there. And we support a large amount of different businesses along the I-4 corridor that are selling goods that are imported to the consumer. In today's world, where people are working at home and staying at home, things like furniture and imported goods are very in demand right now. And so we're happy to be open and be a part of that. The big issue for us, obviously, is how do we protect this $18 billion economic engine that supports 85,000 jobs in Central Florida. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read the names on this slide. I think I wanted you all to get the impression about how diverse a port is when it comes to regulators and partners. So we have partners at federal, state, and local levels that are responsible for all kinds of activity, from security to dredging the channels and to making sure that the products that are imported and exported are safe. Next slide. So one of the things I want to touch on was the relationship between security plans and the nexus to resiliency. I don't think you can really have resiliency without having an organized plan that goes across the industry. So in the case of the maritime industry, there are really two significant plans that we follow that add resiliency to the maritime community, and that's internationally. First, the International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea, that's also known as SOLAS. It's an international treaty that was developed immediately after the Titanic tragedy in 1914. However, due to World War II, the treaty wasn't actually authorized until late 1920s. It's been changed several times, but currently there's over 164 contracting governments that represent 99% of the merchant ships by tonnage. So not 99% of the ships, but 99% of the world's merchant trade is covered by that safety, or is covered by ships that operate under SOLAS. The second part of that is the International Maritime Organization's standards for worldwide port and ship security. So those standards are adopted in the United States through the Maritime Transportation Security Act, MTSA. All ports in the United States follow the MTSA rules, and they are enforced by the Coast Guard. So that is the way the United States lives up to its obligation under the international organization standards. Why is that important for us? I think it's important for several reasons. One, countries with high security standards basically do not face the delays that countries that have a bad reputation do for lax security. So those type of issues do not come up if you're following MTSA closely. And that's in the best interest of our community and resiliency for the products that we receive. As my previous slide stated a couple back, over 90% of the world's international trade trades on ships. So it's very important for people to follow these regulations. And this creates resiliency in the industry because it creates reliability on what your partners are doing in the ports that products are coming from. Next slide, please. So we use a lot of federal grants. You can see on the screen that just since 2015, our port alone has received $6.6+ million in federal grants. We use these grants to buy a lot of different technologies. It could be everything from camera systems to command vehicles. You can see a picture on the bottom right of the screen of our command vehicle right after a hurricane. And then you can see where we have a grant purchase vehicle that's guarding a ship. So that's our part of the resiliency program when it gets to our port. That's how we meet our obligations under the MITSA. And it's also how we create resiliency, because we don't rely on just one system for security or safety. We rely on a layer of systems so that you have multiple opportunities to succeed instead of fail. And when you use technology and cooperation with your personnel that are on the scene. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's on top of everybody's mind right now is COVID-19. What's interesting is ports have actually been planning for epidemic type scenarios for a long time. We and all Florida ports are part of the Regional Domestic Security Task Force Network in Florida. And we spend a lot of time planning for and to prevention of things like terrorism events. One of those has been always the use of some type of health issue to impact the community, to impact the port community using a virus or using some type of contamination of maybe food on a cruise ship. So while we've never really addressed the issue of pandemics from the standpoint of a worldwide health issue, we have addressed the issue multiple times from the standpoint of we know we're vulnerable to health issues in the port community, not only from people on a cruise ship maybe getting sick, but also from the importation of contaminated products. So we work closely with our other government agencies in the private sector to make sure our protocols are acceptable. We have spent a lot of time with the Coast Guard modifying our protocols to make sure our workers are safe, but we can still meet our obligations for security. And obviously we use Centers for Disease Control and State Department of Health and others to determine what's the most appropriate course for us. Next slide, please. So I think we have some good takeaways from, maybe not good from the standpoint of the way they impacted society, but good from our learning standpoint after our COVID-19 experience. One, we've learned that just-in-time inventory systems are extremely vulnerable to supply chain disruption. That's been in the news, and I think that that will continue until people modify the way they do or consider doing business. I know that our end users, the people that receive products from the port, have really been stressed with having inventory shortages because of the supply chain problems. What we've also learned is there was a lot of capacity in the maritime transportation system for containers and cargo, and there's only so much elasticity, and that is gone now. The capacity is pretty much close to full capacity. You see a lot of ships that are having trouble getting ships in the port in a timely manner because of the backups at ports. Part of this is a supply chain issue, and part of it is the fact that things have slowed down at some ports due to procedures that are trying to help stem the COVID spread. I think the other thing, and there are probably people on this call that understand this much better than me, but I think the port never really totally understood the interdependencies between our cargo and the vital supply chains. And we probably learned that the hard way. We don't necessarily know what's in every container that comes in here. And so we are now starting to understand, because we get feedback from the end user customer about where we have these bottlenecks in the supply chain. And of course, our job is to, once it gets on our dock, move it through the port quickly and safely. And we do that with some of the methods I've already discussed. I think a big issue that's come up also is critical infrastructure transportation workers. They need to be a priority for special consideration on vaccinations. Now, the federal government has a document that talks about critical workers in critical infrastructure industries. And workers in our industry and our related industries like rail and truckers are mentioned in that document. But that document is only guidance from the federal government. They can't enforce the document. They can only make it as a recommendation. And every state has decided on its own what their most important populations are. But I think what we do realize is that the critical infrastructure transportation workers are a key to getting needed vital products to the end user. And so those are things that we're going to learn from this pandemic on how to handle that better. And then finally, something everybody's seen too is that healthcare supplies a lot of them are manufactured in foreign countries and they're imported. Maybe a part of something is imported. Maybe it's the whole product. In the past, these have usually been low value cargo products that are transported by container. That's a long journey. It could be 20, 30 days till it gets to the end user. So the supply chain is having to adjust to that because the demand for those products has changed the way people look at them from a standpoint of their criticality in the supply chain. Next slide. So there is a strong nexus between state and port plans for resiliency. I think the perfect example of that is our hurricane preparedness that we go through every year in Florida. As I said before, Florida ports in Tampa and Fort Lauderdale are key to the motor vehicle fuels that are used in Florida. So we spend a lot of time working on those issues. And we spend a lot of time coordinating with our Florida Department of Transportation. The reason why we do that is when we do get in a major weather event, there's a lot of pressure on the ports from the governor and the emergency management staff to know exactly how fast we can get back open. So all this stuff I've been talking about involving security and safety, those all play into our ability to get back to the port quickly and reconstitute a active port so that the people that move those products into the community, whether it's fuel or food or other needed supplies, can operate quickly. And you can see on here, this is a good example of us staging for a hurricane down in the lower left picture at a predetermined location. That is actually during a storm, Irma. And then on the right, you can see a state trooper that's escorting a fuel truck. That's some of the planning that we do, pre-planning we do, and we anticipate that activity when we finally have an event that pops up. Next slide, please. So I think we all understand that there's a major nexus between state and port resiliency when it comes to transportation modes. So I think the perfect example for us to illustrate here is the Sunshine Skyway Bridge that connects Tampa Bay to Manatee County in Florida. And so what you see here obviously is a beautiful bridge. It's part of a highway system that FDOT maintains. And then you also see a ship passing underneath the bridge in several pictures. And you can see how close the smokestacks of that cruise ship actually get to the bottom of that bridge. So the criticality and interconnectivity between these two transportation modes has these key points of possible failure. So if there was to be something to happen underneath that bridge, it basically would shut down all the commerce coming in and out of the port until it was resolved. So a lot of people, while we focus on individual terminals and their security, and that's very important, I think for this group especially to understand that there's a much bigger picture there, which is these interconnected modes of transportation have nexus points where they meet, and it's critical that all the players that control those areas understand the value of that point and the criticality of it. Next slide. That concludes my presentation. As Frank said, we were fortunate to have the Buccaneers win the Super Bowl this year, and we've got a special event that's going on today, so I'm going to be leaving the presentation now. But Frank, would you, or Sil, would you like me to take any questions before I leave?
Most definitely. If there are a couple questions that the group here would like to ask, Mark is now available. Mark, based on your experience, what has been the most challenging piece related to resilience and security for the port that you are director?
So I think the most challenging thing day to day is that there's always a balance between commerce and efficiency, speed, and security and safety. We try to strike that balance every day for the benefit of our operators and the community, understanding that this is a choke point for all the good things that come into the United States or leave, and it has to be an efficient choke point. But on the other hand, it's also maybe could be the last opportunity that we catch some contraband or something bad coming into the United States before it gets out in the general population. So one of the things that we pride ourselves on, and most ports pride themselves on, is that we have quick access to the interstate highway system, so, and to trains also. So the bottom line is that once something gets out of the port, you've got 2 traffic lights and you are on the interstate highway system. You can go all over the United States basically without running into another light unless you leave the interstate system. So it's really critical that we strike that balance, that we protect the community from imported goods that are dangerous or unauthorized and could quickly get into the bloodstream of America if they got through. But striking that balance is something we try to do every day, and I think we're pretty successful at it.
One more question. Is thinking about security the same way of thinking about resilience and sustainability?
I think they go hand in hand, and I think the slide that showed the missions of those safety rules and those security rules are a good example of where those resiliency and security meet. Because when you have those common rules that are shared by everybody around the world, then that in fact does create a resiliency, because everybody's playing on the same page and they understand their roles and responsibilities, and those match up between the different countries that are trading with each other. So I think these security plans and the related safety plans that are also for security go a long way towards creating resiliency, because they create a common operating picture that everybody pretty much understands and goes by, and it creates a good, efficient system if everybody plays by the rules.
We have a couple more questions. I'll ask them and let's see if we can manage to have you respond both of them. They're fairly fast. Are ports having to revisit the area maritime security plans to add lessons learned since the recent pandemic? And the second question, is there a focus on raising the priority of healthcare supplies in supply chain?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. The supply chain is obviously controlled by private entities for the most part. The government could have some role in that by expediting commerce through cargo if they understood what the criticality of the commerce. But I think that's really a private industry thing, and that's what we're grappling with governments. Is governments only have so much control over the supply chain, and so if we're made aware, as I said, I don't think we really totally understood just how we fit in the supply chain. We just know we get cargo and release it. So I think it's a private sector issue, and they have options as far as expediting it. The thing about the area maritime security committees, those are institutions that are in every port in the United States, and it's where industry, the port authorities, and government, our government partners come together to discuss not only new and involving rules, but also discuss ways of doing our business more efficient for the benefit of everybody. And I would say they've also played a role in very important things, not only in coordinating some COVID activity, but also in the cybersecurity world. So they are an important part of that picture.
Thank you, Mark, and success to your work, and congratulations on Florida's achievement.
Okay, thank you all. I appreciate everybody's attention and enjoyed being here. Thank you.
Now we are going to proceed to our next speaker, Margaret from the Corps of Engineers, talking about the project that they worked with the Department of Homeland Security. Margaret, it's all yours.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited to be here and to tell you about a project that I've been involved with. My name is Margaret Kurth, as Bill mentioned. I'm with the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center in the Environment Lab, and I work for a small team that does risk and decision science research and development. So as you can tell from the name, we're a very generalist sort of team, actually. And we think about all sorts of risk and decision science problems, and especially emerging risks and how to move the concept of resilience into practice has been kind of a theme over the past many years. Well, so this morning I'm going to present on an up-and-coming guide about how to conduct a resilience assessment of marine transportation systems. And by that, I mean single ports, networks of ports, and inland waterway systems. As it relates to this conference, the marine transportation system is a crucial part of the larger national freight transportation system, moving 70% of U.S. international trade by weight. The transport of cargo and passengers by vessel is designated as a national critical function. And so you'll see through this presentation why it's of interest to Department of Homeland Security. So the project is a collaborative effort of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. It's a component of Department of Homeland Security and also of the Engineer Research and Development Center, which is one research arm of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Between these two entities, they have lots of mission support and a large portfolio of efforts to support the marine transportation system. And probably some of you have interacted with some of those efforts in terms of analytics, partnerships, guides, etc. So the purpose of the guidebook that we've been authoring is to provide users with a shared understanding of how to design and conduct a resilience assessment. Also to close the gap between available resources and needs by organizing and identifying many planning tools, academic studies, data sets, and methodologies that we think will be useful for assessing the marine transportation system. And that's been a big effort, and I hope that the users are going to find it to be useful, and also to illustrate the assessment process through examples and case studies across those three scopes that I described: the single port, multi-port network, and inland transportation system, and representative of a wide variety of different system types and potential applications. So from this guide authoring process, I'm going to pull out some highlights that I think are especially interesting and also make the guidebook unique. So if you're in the session on resilience and sustainability, you are probably already familiar with resilience as a concept, and you also know that it's an objective that a lot of work has gone into pinning down in recent years. You may have seen this kind of classic resilience basing graphic before, where we have performance on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. Different types of events, be they extreme weather or man-made hazards, can disrupt normal performance, which is what you see happening here. We have a small disruption, which hasn't really, it's just a blip in performance, barely. But then another more major disruption that knocks down the performance of the system. Performance can be any number of things that you have metrics for. You know, the amount of throughput through the port, for example. And we have these various capabilities that kind of determine how the system is going to perform through time when a disruption does occur. And then not only how it initially performs, how much performance is lost, for example, but then what capabilities take effect to help the system regain that functionality. Oh, geez. So then through adaptation, the hope here is through adaptation, mitigation, and preparedness, the hope is that we can improve the performance of a system under stress through disruptions, shocks, and then like more chronic long-term stressors such as sea level rise. To a point that was made in the last presentation, or a question that was made, I just want to mention that we see the concepts and management objectives that are related to resilience, like risk mitigation, security, sustainability, et cetera, as all having a role in resilience, and also vice versa. So you can imagine that a security activity, for example, which I think of as reducing the chance of a threat materializing, can diminish some potential disturbance from occurring, and also that a more resilient system, say that can recover more quickly, will be less vulnerable to security threats. So the research team that I work with advocates that these management objectives shouldn't really be assumed to be 100% complementary, and that there are likely trade-offs between the different objectives. So if you're going to be building robustness, you might be increasing your fragility, for example. And so that those trade-offs should be explicitly considered in order to, you know, avoid unintended consequences. So the last slide was to kind of illustrate initially that resilience assessment is complicated. There are all of these capabilities that actually lead to how a system performs. And then this, to continue in that same vein, this is more of, you know, it's complicated. I have this kind of cloud where I've brainstormed some of the capabilities that might actually be necessary in order to recover from a disruption. So it's not just the capability to recover, but here are the things that you might actually need to have that capability. And this is just, you know, a small sample of that I could think of off the top of my head. And generally, you know, these kind of components that you need will fall into, you know, the physical infrastructure kind of backbone of your system, but then also information and communication, social behavior, or other kind of more social dimensions, and governance and decision making. So if you'd like to be able to recover your functionality in 3 days, here are some of the things that you might need to have. One more point here is that there's kind of an interesting research question in what is the optimal balance between how you can build resilience into the system through the actual design of infrastructure, and then what actions can you plan so that, you know, you can recover and adapt effectively. And I think that ports are actually a very good example of where they are already striking that balance. Okay, so something that's kind of unique, I think, about the guidebook that I've been referring to is that it emphasizes, it has this critical functions framing, where it emphasizes that functions and services of the marine transportation system are of interest, not just the specific components. And this framing stems from the Department of Homeland Security National Critical Function Construct, which has evolved to more effectively address system-wide and cross-sector risks. And so here on this slide, you see that actual infrastructure systems are all the way over on the right, and we relate those to the functions that they provide. Now, for individual ports, it can be challenging to be thinking about the larger critical function. As the last speaker mentioned, the role of the port in the supply chain is something that's a little bit outside of their purview in the past, but that in a resilience assessment, we try to expand that purview to the greatest extent that we can and recognize the different roles and dependencies that exist. Sorry, I'm really slow at advancing my slides. Okay, so there's a lot going on in this slide, but essentially this is a graphic that sums up the process that we've developed for stakeholders to organize around and understand complicated systems and assess how they'll perform their intended functions under stress and during disruptive shocks. Importantly, it walks the user through a process of developing their own analytical methodology that's tailored to meet their needs and capabilities. So it's not a process, it's not a checklist, for example, that any type of system should pick up and run down the list. It's actually that you're designing what resilience means for your system and how to evaluate that. And so that's where that list of resources that I mentioned comes in. We point the user to go get this data set if you need it, and go use this type of analysis if you need it, and have this type of tabletop exercise, et cetera. And in doing so, you're designing your own analytical methodology. And I'll just point out briefly that, we structure this, though, that you should be doing your own resilience assessment, but make sure that you're achieving these objectives as you're going through, so that there still is a consistency across the process, across different projects, that everybody is meeting the same objectives and truly conducting a resilience assessment. I'm sorry, I haven't been keeping the time, so I may just breeze through this a little bit, but here are the objectives with lots of detail, the types of questions you want to be kind of probing your system with and pulling in different analytical methodologies in order to get at this question of how much will the system's performative function and quality change over the course of gradual stress or a shock. We provide different types of best practices or pulling from existing resilience assessments to illustrate what have other ports done in the past in order to build their resilience. And I just want to briefly mention that beyond this guide, the Engineer Research and Development Center and also DHS are interested in supply chain vulnerabilities and the federal perspective on that, and how it can, how the federal government can be acting in this really complicated landscape where we have industry and we have these just-in-time extreme vulnerabilities, but ultimately they have consequences for the nation. And so we have a role to play there and lots of research to be done, including, lessons learned from COVID. So thank you for your time. The guidebook itself is anticipated to come out this year. It has lots of review to go through, and I'm happy to take any questions you have. Thank you.
So let's start, Margaret, exploring a little bit your presentation. Have some of these studies been based in some real case situations? And what has been the most critical element from all those different factors that you listed in your presentation, that perhaps people may have the aha moment?
Well, to your first question, Department of Homeland Security runs a program called the Regional resilience assessment program in which they partner with private industry, including port authorities, to conduct resilience assessments. And so this project actually came out of that program. That's one that is, maybe people are familiar with it, but it has, private industry information, and so it's not a process. It doesn't create products that are publicly available. This is to move that methodology into something that everybody has access to. So yes, there have been many resilience assessments that have taken place, and hence this. I actually need some clarification on your second question, though. So you were saying, what is something that I can point to here to help people have an aha moment?
Yes, things that that perhaps in your studies, it might have been like a low-hanging fruit, and as you get the chance to examine close, then it is something that could be a good practice that the group can take as definitely take a look at this. It's not just something there, it's not a minor factor.
Well, sure. So I think that governance and relationships have proven to be really important in successful outcomes in the past. For example, I don't remember the exact name, but there's groups that get together following her that were very helpful in helping in New York and New Jersey have successful outcomes after Hurricane Sandy. Also, things like cargo sequencing could be a low-hanging fruit. Also, the ability of workers to get to their job is crucially important. So some of these resilience enhancements are not actually infrastructural in nature, and those can be low-hanging fruit. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, that's perfect. Let's give it one more minute just to see if we have some questions coming through the chat. While we wait just a little bit, are you involved in any new types of research that can come out as additional guidance to this work that you're already involved in, you're presenting?
Well, sure. So we're actively pursuing research around supply chain vulnerabilities. Right now, of interest is actually the food supply chain and how that kind of overlaps as well with food insecurity, and how some vulnerabilities in the supply chain have been exploited by COVID, and will likely be exploited as well by extreme weather, and how lack of reliability in supply and demand can accumulate and impact individuals' food security. So I think that will be really interesting. Similarly, no, actually, I'll leave it there. Supply chains are really a very rich area for research, and I think of great national interest and benefit. And so that's something that we are just getting into.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Oh, there is one question. Very quickly, and then we're going to proceed to the next speaker. So the question is, was the CMTS involved in development of the guidebook?
Oh, that's a great question. So the short answer is yes. There's a committee member who is my colleague, Catherine Chambers. She's a co-PI on this project, and so she brings that perspective to the guidebook. And then we also have many rounds of review, which we're undergoing. And so interaction with the CMTS, if it's not already happening, it's definitely going to happen before this is released. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Margaret.
Yeah, and anybody, please feel free to email me with any more questions or comments. I would love to get feedback on whether this makes sense, and also to make sure that you're able to get the guide when it comes out. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we are going to welcome Casey Grigsby. She is the Vice President of the Florida Port Council, and she is also going to present us a study in resilience that they've been conducting. Welcome, Casey.
Thank you so much for having me. Casey Grigsby, Florida Ports Council. I'm the Vice President of Programs and Planning. The Florida Ports Council is a 501c6 that conducts research through a different arm of the organization called the FSTED Council. As many of you know, seaports are not standalone facilities. They are integral components of the national, state, and regional economies. The resiliency and the ability to coordinate freight movement through our ports in the time of stress on the existing infrastructure and operations is something that we've worked on over the years to find best practices, not only for our state, but for the nation. As a peninsular state, Florida is constantly faced with complex issues that most of our other port and freight entities are not faced with. So related to the short and long-term resiliency, we have conducted planning for infrastructure in the maritime industry to not only address, like we were discussing earlier, the pandemic, but also sea level rise and environmental issues. Next slide, please. Jimmy, next slide. Oh, there we go. If you didn't know or weren't aware, there are 15 public seaports in the state of Florida, 14 being active. The actions of an individual seaport will largely determine the timing and ability to process cargo in an efficient, cost-effective manner and be in a position to support the needs of constituents, not only on a daily basis, but also in the event of an emergency or weather disaster. The Florida ports view resiliency as a long-term investment and have been ever improving the process that requires continuous appraisal, both at the seaport level, the county government, and the state level, as well as the federal as well. Resilient seaports properly integrate their local preparedness plans and long-term comp plans with the transportation and freight mobility plans that already exist. By making sure that all of these plans are coordinated and talk together, they can be a tremendous asset to the state and county when any sort of disaster strikes. Next up. Why is it important specifically for Florida seaports to be resilient? Mainly jobs in our economy. 900,000 direct and indirect jobs are supported by seaports. All of the numbers that I'm going to present right now are from the 2019 data and do not address the current state of cargo during COVID. The last economic impact study did also include that we support $40 billion in personal income, as well as $117.6 billion in economic value for our local and state government. And one of the questions we get a lot is, do you pay taxes? Do you support the tax infrastructure for our state and local entities? And the answer is absolutely. We contribute $4.3 billion in local and state tax revenue every year. Next slide, please. So in terms of resiliency for cargo, one of the first things we saw in the pandemic was panic throughout the state that there wasn't enough toilet paper, that there wasn't enough fuel, we weren't getting cargo. This was something that actually wasn't true. Florida seaports continue to move throughout the pandemic and are active today, and many of our ports have seen an increase in the amount and type of cargo they are moving. Overall, the ports contribute $86.6 billion in waterborne trade to the state, with 111 million tons of cargo every year, 4.1 million TEUs, and that's traded over 200 countries. This includes exports and imports. We do import more than we export, but that's something, the dynamic of that is changing every year. So it's important for us to continue to keep moving and coordinate with our freight partners to make sure that these goods and services are coming to the individual people of Florida, as well as the tourists who are continually coming to our state. Next. Again, this was pre-COVID, but our top 3 trading partners account for 92.9% of all trade through the state's seaports. And that's South and Central America, the Caribbean, Asia, and Europe. The dynamic of this has changed a little bit since COVID. We haven't updated it because it is something that's constantly changing through tariffs, as well as the dynamic of our local and state governments. Next slide, please. Cruise. This is something we have reevaluated during the time of COVID, and something that most people don't think of when it comes to hurricane season as well. The resiliency of a port has to take into account that there are cruises with 1,000 people, 5,000 people out floating in the ocean when a hurricane's coming. So we do have to prepare in advance for when are they going to come back in? How can we assist with that? 60% of all U.S. cruise activity comes through the Florida seaports. We have the top 3 seaports in the entire world located here, as well as many of the headquarters for those cruise lines. Prior to the COVID shutdown last March, the previous year total had accounted for the highest amount of cruisers in history, and that was 18.3 million passenger movements, and $7.69 billion of income were generated in our local governments. Which all leads to the resiliency study. As we mentioned earlier, we've had to change how things work within our seaports and freight due to COVID. But prior to that even starting, we created this report, the Florida Ports Council and the FSTED Council. And the report was to begin documenting and sharing best practices across the state and nation, specifically for seaports. As Mark Dubina from Port Tampa Bay indicated, we've learned a number of lessons over the past year and a half in regards to supply chains, modal coordination, and the ability to pivot production and meet demands of ports and freight systems. The Florida ports have a unique challenge this year, juggling not only COVID, but combining that with weather events, planning for sea level rise, hurricanes, freight bottlenecks, and the coordination and access to modal partners in the trucking and rail industry assisted in ensuring that high demand goods were effectively moving from our ports to our end users. This study focused not only on our ports, but as Margaret mentioned earlier, New York and New Jersey, and some of the weather events that happened up there with I believe it was Hurricane Sandy, to find out what were some of the weak links in those individual situations, and how can we prevent that from happening in the future. Seaports have found over the years we have to have access to generators and fuel generators to ensure that the moment the storm has passed, we have access to our buildings and to continue the flow of fuel through our seaports. Port Everglades and Port Tampa Bay are our main fuel ports in the state, and they supply almost all of the fuel, not only for your individual personal cars, but also for aviation as well. All backup technology and communication systems. We found through Hurricane Michael that these systems needed to be in a cloud as the server at Port Panama City crashed during Hurricane Michael, and those people didn't have access to their systems for weeks. All critical documentation, whether it's attorneys, insurance, personnel files, are now located in an off-site area, as well as in paper copies for when the hurricane hits, so that if there is a downtime for a port being dramatically shut down, those executive level staff have access to the information they need so they can check on their employees quickly. They can ensure that all insurance claims through the state, federal government, and private entities are filed in a timely manner. One of the things we did right at the beginning of this resiliency report was we worked with our CMAC council, the Seaport Environmental Management Committee, to put in place memorandums of understanding between all of our ports. What this does is provides a quicker way to receive FEMA reimbursement for any assistance provided. So if a hurricane is coming towards Port Tampa Bay, this memorandum of understanding allows Jacksport, Miami, Port Panama City to send resources and personnel to that port to assist in cleanup and getting everything back online in a quick fashion. Through this, FEMA is able to reimburse those ports who assisted in their time of need. And it provides us a community aspect of all of our ports working together to make sure that the state of Florida has a seamless supply chain when we really need it most. Next slide, please. As Margaret indicated earlier, one of the biggest things we can do is prepare and coordinate efforts in advance. The Florida ports are leading the nation in resiliency planning so they can withstand and recover from any environmental changes or disruptive events. The seaports were required to address environmental issues as it stood in comp plans. This included sea level rise and upgrades to infrastructure for resiliency in their master planning process. The useful life of infrastructure for seaports can be between 20 and 50 years. That's the typical lifespan for a berth or a wharf. And they're at a height of 7.5 to 12.5 feet above water. All port cargo equipment is designed based on the current ship sizes, which changes with each new generation of vessel. So by planning for sea level rise in advance with our infrastructure, we don't have to spend the additional money to make our ports resilient in terms of sea level rise, because by the time they expire their useful life, it's already time to change them. And sea level rise has already been included in all of our plans. There's no immediate need to update the equipment and infrastructure, given the lifespan of the current infrastructure and the estimated sea levels. However, ports continue to work with local, state, and federal partners to assess the inventory and address modifications as needed. The cargo handling equipment is also included in all master plans and gives an additional accommodation of 2.5 feet of tidal accommodations, which is within the sea level rise increases up to the year 2050. When disaster-related vessels and cargo surges are anticipated, diverted shipments can cause logistical challenge, not only for the seaport, but for our freight partners in trucking and rail. The Florida seaports have approached this in a different manner and have the memorandum of understanding with the ports to send that extra equipment in that event. Our coordination with stakeholders is critical for our seaport resiliency. And in the pre-planning stages, we ensure that each port is designated as a critical infrastructure within the county and local government. What this does, being designated as critical infrastructure, is that if a hurricane hits a seaport, the city or county authority ensures that the port is one of the first related infrastructures to receive services to make sure that electric, water, and any other disruptions in infrastructure like highways are one of the first things that are fixed. So hospitals and seaports. The reason for this is to ensure that we have that fuel going in and out, the water you need, toilet paper, and it minimizes the freight and fuel disruptions, making it a top priority for communities. The critical elements of seaport response and recovery are channel surveying and reopening, restoring electrical power, and resuming fuel terminal operations. As they are the critical component in recovery, we include these coordinations to make sure that infrastructure, personnel, technology, and communications support all recovery efforts and are pre-planned the year in advance, in addition to doing practice runs before hurricane season. Working with Coast Guard, NOAA, and the Army Corps of Engineers, The Florida ports are able to clear channels in a quick manner and prioritize what needs to be done first. As Margaret mentioned in her question response, government and public entities have been identified to create the soft skill, low-hanging fruit to improve our best practices in this area. The Florida ports have continued to work with state and local governments as well as the utility providers to harden any electrical infrastructures and build power redundancy in addition to the infrastructure critical needs that has been established in their local governments. By ensuring we have a hardened electrical infrastructure, it provides less work for the city and county governments to have to come and work on the port. And the seaports have done something very unique when it comes to technology, that they've invested in a single information reporting software called the Aries Command Bridge. This connects and shares information to all ports as well as the state and federal agencies during a critical event. This ensures that the port recovery and broader access to Florida ports are collaborative with the petroleum industry and the Coast Guard that invests in the infrastructure to continue our port operations. Next slide. And that's in my presentation. I'll be happy to take any questions, concerns, as well as if you want to contact me personally, I'm sure we can get you that information as well. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Casey. Very quick question. Looking at the resilience of the ports, is there an understanding on the shift of what would be the critical point for the supply chain that starts with the ports, looking at the transportation infrastructure as a whole for the success of the continuity of the activities?
Absolutely. That's something that we address not only in our master plans, but our continued partnerships with our other freight partners. The Florida Trucking Association is a great example. And I'll use hurricanes as the best, easiest example. If a hurricane is coming towards the state of Florida, we have an online database that shows which ports are open, partially open, or about to be closed due to wind and rain that's coming in that direction. The Florida Ports Council works in conjunction with the Trucking Association the entire time to assist the truckers in pre-finding safe locations to be at while that hurricane's coming through. And while the hurricane is coming through, they may stage in one location and may safely be in a hotel. Soon as we know that it's becoming clearer that the port is opening soon, we reach back out to the Trucking Association so they can let their members know between these hours we will probably be open, and we can continue that continuity between our modal partners. This is written in their master plans as well, as I know Mark Dubina mentioned it. That goes with the security and safety of a port, that we have to have continuing communication with local, state, and transportation partners throughout any emergency.
Fantastic. One more question. Casey, is there a location online to get more information on the Aries Command Bridge you mentioned?
I don't believe there is something that's specifically related to it, but our resiliency study goes into great detail about the Aries Command Bridge, as well as some of the individual works on some of our ports to have similar software and hardware built into their ports to ensure they're resilient. That resiliency study is at flaports.org. And from there, if you click into the resource section, there should be a direct access to that. And I'll be happy to send it to anyone after this presentation as well, if you like.
Fantastic. I am seeing we are a little bit short on time. I want to encourage everybody to get in touch with the speakers as they all offered to do that. And Frank, I'm turning this back to you. Thank you.